Hey, y'all, I'm Bud Elliott, and this is my college football summer school series on Cover 3. I bring on the team experts from the 24/7 sports staff and ask them the questions I care about. No fluff. Which players will be toughest to replace? What position groups are sneakily better or worse than I realize? We get you the scoop on each team in 20 minutes or less. Let's go. Hey, guys, welcome back. Summer school today. We are talking the resurgent Washington Huskies, 11-2 last year, and to do that, I'm going to bring in the foremost expert. That's Chris Fetters of Dawgman.com. Chris, welcome to Cover 3.
Thanks, man. I'm really surprised, or not surprised, but I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely, man. This is fantastic. 11-2, the best Washington team since 2016. I think we can all probably agree on.
Yeah, the playoff team for sure.
I mean, Kalen DeBoer comes in, and he had won everywhere he'd been, and I didn't expect them to go. I figured he would return their offense to competency after what we had seen under Jimmy Lake, and he did a lot more than that, bringing in a top 15, top 10 offense, depending on what metric you like. It had to be pretty fun to cover this first season.
It was a blast. I mean, first of all, DeBoer and his staff, all top-notch guys, better people than they are coaches, which, sometimes in this crazy college football world, you can't always say, but it is a fact. Kalen DeBoer is so down to earth, just a genuine guy. What you get from him on the side is the same that you're going to get behind the camera. That kind of genuine personality and character really shines through, and it really is something that is valued at the University of Washington. But yeah, 11-2, no one could have ever thought that was coming. Again, he does come with a resume of championships from Sioux Falls, and then what he did at Fresno State in his short time there. But Jen Cohen did her homework, the Washington athletic director, in finding DeBoer the right fit, the right character guy to come in after Jimmy Lake and kind of rearrange the offense under Ryan Grubb. Obviously surpassed all expectations. The big X factor was going to be Michael Penix, the former Indiana quarterback, and what could he do coming off injuries. And we saw the best of Michael Penix in 2022 for sure, setting records, becoming a legitimate Heisman candidate for 2023. And then defensively, they really showed up. They weren't the best in the world, but they certainly held their own end of the bargain and allowed this offense to get the ball back and to really make some things happen and completely turn that side of the ball, not just around, but completely upside down. I mean, they were completely unrecognizable from a year ago in terms of the offense. So, yeah, I mean, for what they did in 2022, obviously the bar is set so high now for this coming season, but I don't think those guys would have it any other way.
So Michael Penix decides to come back, 31-8 touchdown interception ratio, 8.2 yards per drop back, 50% success rate, which is like just shy of Caleb Williams at USC or Drake May at Carolina. A really elite year from him. That's pretty well established. I'll ask you, since you get to see this guy every day, where can he get better? How does he take his game to yet another level if that's possible?
Well, I think now that he's fully healthy and has had a whole season under his belt, the first season where he's been fully healthy, and since he's been a college quarterback, I think now can he maybe start to use his legs just a little bit more. He doesn't have to go crazy scrambling around and being the second coming of like a Johnny Manziel or something like that. But I think he has that element in his game. I think it's a little underrated. I think he deliberately kind of underused it because, first of all, he wants to be a pocket guy. That's where he's at his best. That is his ultimate strength, is finding players downfield, playing and throwing with anticipation. But I think if he identifies some opportunities where he can scramble a little bit more, just because defenses are so keyed in on his downfield passing ability, I think he can maybe exploit some things in the run a little bit. I think, again, that was probably something that, he probably was never going to use a ton of anyways. But I think if he can strategically figure out his points where he can utilize it, and especially with Ryan Grubb, can he call maybe a quarterback delay or a quarterback draw or something in a key moment where the defense is anticipating something based on circumstance and he can completely fool them with his legs. That's a situation where I think Michael Penix can still show a little extra side of him that, when you're talking about competing with the Caleb Williams of this world, when it comes to the Heisman type situations. You got Bo Nix at Oregon. I mean, the Pac-12 is absolutely loaded at quarterback this fall, as everyone knows. And if he can find some way to utilize his legs, maybe just a little bit more to complete that part of the picture for the national audience, I think that will allow him to legitimately compete for the Heisman Trophy.
So this offense last year was pretty rarely stopped. When it was, the data says a lot of teams just kind of play sag, drop everybody back, and then deny the explosive play, hope to win in the red zone. Has DeBoer or Grubb talked about finding ways to have more 1 to 2, 3 play drives, create more explosive plays? It feels like the teams that were able to slow them down were the ones that did stop that and make them just drive the field, which they were pretty good at in most games. It looks like it. Is that a renewed emphasis for this year?
I think they always want to create more explosives, right? I think every offense in the country wants to create more explosives. There's no doubt about that. And I'm sure that that's going to be a point of emphasis for them. I also honestly think a big point of emphasis for these guys is finishing drives, finishing for touchdowns, finishing in the red zone, finishing on 3rd and short, 4th and short. You go back even to the Michigan State game, as efficient and as good as that offense was, there were a couple drives near the goal line where Michigan State shut them down. And, that could have been a wide open game. That could have been an absolute no-brainer by the 3rd quarter if Washington had taken care of business on a couple drives where they just pretty much got stuffed at the line of scrimmage. And I think that's something where I think they want to just become a little bit more efficient at. But at the same time, as you said, if they can get those 1, 2, 3 play drives where they're hitting people over the top and they're getting Rome Odunze open, they're getting Jalen McMillan open, they're getting Jalen Polk open, they're getting some of these younger kids like a Jeremy Bernard or Denzel Boston, getting Giles Jackson open through the slot. You can get some of these guys for just, explosive plays, just cutting defenses open. Sometimes you don't have to worry about, slogging drives for 13, 14 plays and, converting 3 or 4 3rd downs, 4th downs, what have you. So they just want to get more efficient in general. And obviously, if you can do that with explosive plays, that's just a bonus.
You mentioned McMillan and Odunze and Polk, and I'm really happy to see Polk get an offensive coordinator who knows how to coach offense. When he originally transferred to Washington, I was like, I don't know. And I felt bad for the kid because I had been at the opening back when he used to have the openings, Houston, and he was really good there. And I was like, who the heck is this kid? It turned out he had broken his leg, I think, the 1 year in high school, so maybe didn't get quite as highly recruited as he could have been. I think he's got some real ability. This is one of my favorite receiving corps in the country. Is there one of these 3 guys that you think has a chance to just make it just next level, like to where not the Marvin Harrison Jr. conversation, but is there a guy who could emerge as like, oh, that's like a top 3 or 4 receiver in the country type thing?
Well, if there is a Marvin Harrison comp on this Washington receiving corps, it would be Rome Odunze. He's got that special blend of size and speed, can high point balls, can get behind guys, but can also be a possession guy when he needs to be, can come up with that key catch on 3rd down, can move the chains, can keep drives going. He is probably the guy that's going to, all those Washington receivers that you named, he's probably the first one that's going to get drafted, this time next year. Jalen McMillan is he's clutch. I mean, he is absolutely, he's a blanket, just for any quarterback out there. If you want to be, a quarterback's best friend, you get a guy like Jalen McMillan out there because he's going to find open spots. He's going to cut open the zones. And he's going to be able to come up with clutch catch again and again and again. But you mentioned Jalen Polk, buddy. He's just coming from Texas Tech. He came from a program where they were going to throw the ball to him a ton, and they've continued to do that under Ryan Grubb here at Washington. And you saw against Michigan State coming up with big touchdowns to really extend that game early and kind of try to put that game out of reach early. And he is a guy that, he is the number 3 at Washington right now, but he could be a legitimate number 1 at a lot of other programs. And that really does speak to the depth of the receiving corps here under Jamarcus Shepard.
It's pretty amazing that they're able to keep this trio of receivers together and get Penix back. One group where on the offense where they did not get everybody back, that they do lose 3 of their top 5 offensive linemen, but at least by snap count. What's the concern level here? Are they able to have status quo? Is it possible step forward, step back? What's your thoughts on that, Chris?
Well, I don't know if you can completely go status quo because you do lose Jackson Kirkland, who, was a stalwart of that offensive line for a long time, did have to battle through some injuries, but he was a big time player at Washington. You add in Henry Bainivalu as the right guard, who was another stalwart, another guy who just played for years and years. Also had to battle through some injuries, but really stuck through it. And then Corey Luciano at center. Anytime you lose your center and lose that kind of continuity between the offensive line and the quarterback, because right now, at least as far as Scott Huff's concerned, the Washington offensive line coach, that center is your quarterback. He's the quarterback of the offensive line. And they've got Mateo Mele, who's going to fill in for that role. He was the number 2 guy last year. He comes in right away. So in that way, it's not so much seamless transition, but there was a guy that was ready-made that has been a veteran of that offensive line. He's going to slot right in. And then they've got a couple guys that were, originally slated in as tackles when they came to Washington. You look at Julius Buelow on the left guard, and you look at Nate Kalepo at right guard. Those guys have been veterans as well. They've played in a ton of games. Their time is now, and they have to basically just step up and take over for Kirkland and Bainivalu. And I think they'll do that. I mean, you look at those guys, they're huge kids. I mean, Julius Buelow at left guard, he's 6'8", 330. I mean, as far as an interior guy, it doesn't get much bigger than that. And then you look at the other side at right guard, Nate Kalepo is no slouch. He's 6'5", 6'6", 330. So they've got just some real size on the line this year. But I tell you what, their tackles, I think right now are elite. You look at Troy Fautanu on the left, he's already getting All-American mentions. You got Roger Rosengarten, who's a pup on the right-hand side as a redshirt freshman, played every single game for Washington last year, really kind of solidified that thing. Washington's been really blessed lately at right tackle. Their last big-time right tackle was Caleb McGarry, who's done a phenomenal job in the NFL. Roger Rosengarten's picked up right where Caleb McGarry left off. So Washington has a really strong offensive line right now. Where they need to come up is the guys right behind them. If they lose one or two guys, they've got some guys that can fill in, but will that depth show the talent, show the quality where they can step right in, be the next guy up, and without any drop off? That will be the key to see how well this offensive line does, because you can always count on a guy going down every once in a while, whether it's short term, just a game or two, or whether there's a long-term injury. Knock on wood, you don't want that to happen. But if for some reason something like that happens, you've got to have one of those younger guys, like a Garen Hatchett is a guy that's got to come in, and he's already shown he can play a number of different positions. He is a guy that is chomping at the bit to get in there and show that he's, he may be a young kid, but he can play. His younger brother, Landon, just came in as a true freshman, is already kind of in the depth a little bit at center. Probably Scott Huff's first true recruited center. So they've got some guys that can fill some pieces. But that starting 5, it's going to be really, really important to keep those guys healthy and keep them together, because I think they could be a very strong unit in 2023.
Yeah, they are. That's no doubt. Kind of a top 5, top 7 offense in the country. Defensively last year, we're talking to Chris Fetters, Dawgman.com. Chris, you covered Washington for how many years now?
About over 20 years now.
All right. So 20 years, Chris Fetters, Dawgman.com. Top 50 defense last year. Everybody who's at least 270 pounds, who played at least 100 snaps, is back. That's like 7 guys. They should be a pretty decent interior defensive front in the defense they run. Is there a guy in that group you could single out who could be more of a difference maker than he was last year? A guy you think's primed to really take a big step and be a difference maker?
Well, when you talk about Washington's interior, you've got to start with Latuli Gasanoa. Thule has been the stalwart. He's been there. He's multi-year starter. He is your steady Eddie guy. He's the guy that makes things tick inside. I don't expect him to make a big monster move forward, but yet if he drops off a little bit, that definitely affects the rest of that line. So he needs to really just kind of be that real rock in the middle that the rest of the guys can count on. Now he's got guys around him. You look at Fatui Tuatele, who, Tuatele had one of the most storied high school careers coming out of Hawaii of any player I've ever covered. He's already in the high school Hall of Fame, and he's still in college. That'll tell you a little bit about what he was able to do when he was at St. Louis High School in Honolulu. The kid is a player, but he's always suffered from a little bit. He had a tricep injury or an injury to one of his chest muscles, and it just never has fully allowed him to really, I think, kind of achieve the heights that he's always wanted to have. But this is the year where I think he can make a real move, like a money type move, like a potential NFL type move. He's always had that potential. Jacob Bandis is another guy that's right in there that I think had a monster spring, because Tuatele and Letuiga-Sonoa, they didn't play a ton in spring. So that allowed guys like Bandis, and then also Ulumulo Ale, MJ Ale, who is in his final year. He actually moved to defensive line from the offensive line a couple years ago. And this last year was kind of getting his feet wet, kind of getting back to where he was as a defensive player, because he did play a little defense in high school. But man alive, if MJ Ale could come in and really be the kind of wrecking ball that I think he could be, because he's legit 6'6", 340, this guy has a potential to be a world beater if he could really harness all of his ability. Because the last guy of that size who really came in and just turned in a monster performance year after year at Washington was Vita Vea. And if he could be a Vita Vea type player, just even 75% of Vita Vea for his senior year, what that could give that defensive line at Washington would be tremendous, because you've got younger guys coming in on him. You got a freshman last year in Javon Parker, who came in with his twin Armand, who was dinged up and redshirted. Both the Parker boys, the twins, they're starting to come through. They played a bunch this spring, and so they're coming through. You've got younger kids, Linneus Davis, true freshman coming in from Minnesota, didn't play a bunch. He came in early this spring, but didn't play a ton, probably a redshirt this year. But you've got a lot of depth in that group. Voy Tanufi is another kid that I've got to talk about too, because Voy Tanufi, especially in a situation where if Washington could get offenses really behind the sticks, like third and long, you can bring in, they did it a ton last year, but they had Voy Tanufi at 255, 260 pounds at the nose, and the rest of their linemen, quote unquote linemen, were their edge players. Guys like Zion Tupola-Fatui, guys like Braylon Trice, both getting All-American mentions right now. So that they can really mix it up a lot. They can do a lot of things defensively in terms of scheme along that front. But right now, if I had to pick one or two guys that you're talking about that could really be impact guys that need to step up, I'd say Fatui Tuatele, Jacob Bandis, and Ulumulo Ale are probably the three guys that need to come in and really kind of match what Tuli Letuiga-Sonoa has done the last year or two. And if those guys can do that, then they will definitely be a force to reckon with.
Fantastic. At linebacker, they lose Jeremiah Martin. I thought he had a tremendous year for them, like a 3% havoc rate, which for a backer is excellent. As you mentioned, they do have Braylon Trice. They do have Tupola. I probably botched that pronunciation. I apologize. You guys have some unique names up there. That's got to take a little time to learn those for sure each year. What's the drop off here? Like losing Martin and those guys.
Well, definitely Jeremiah Martin was, he was a stalwart on that edge. He came in from Texas A&M, really solidified things as one of their key edge players, no doubt about it. They also lost Savell Smalls to the portal, a kid who was a 5-star kid coming out of high school in Seattle, really had a lot of potential to be one of those impact type players, but never really fully realized it. I think he was right there on the cusp. But they brought in a couple of guys, like they brought in Zach Durfee from Sioux Falls, who, right now, if he could come from that low a program and be a difference maker in the Pac-12 this fall, could be an incredible story. He didn't do a ton until maybe like the last week of spring ball. But boy, when he showed up, like their spring event, whatnot, he really started to show off and flashed his quickness around the edge. Some of his moves were really impressive to watch. This is a kid who's 6'5", 250, really has not played a ton of defense at all. Is only a few years out of high school in terms of even just starting to play football. So there's a lot of miles on those tires when you talk about a guy like Zach Durfee. He could be definitely someone in the Pac-12 that just people are talking about right now. And for good reason. They wouldn't necessarily know about him. But I think Zach Durfee could be a guy that you could watch a little bit. But, Zion Tupola-Fatui, Braylon Trice, those are going to be the bell cows. Those are the guys you really have to watch. And then behind them, you got Durfee, but you've got Sakai Afoasoao. You've got George. I mean, there's other guys. Maurice Himes. Maurice Himes was a kid. It looked like he had suffered a really bad injury the very, very first day of spring ball, and then comes back like a few days later running around like it never happened. This is another kid. He's German. came in on an exchange deal, went to school in SoCal. Washington recruited him, got him to sign, and he's another kid that just is nothing but just pure athleticism and potential. Another guy that's about 6'5", 250, and has just really flashed it. And then they have a true freshman that came in Anthony James from Texas, who came in with a lot of fanfare, one of the top edge guys out there, and he is shown to have an incredible work ethic. And another guy that's just chomping at the bit to really show people what he can do, and let people know that, hey, I didn't come in early as a true freshman just to ride the pine. I want to play. I want to get in the depth. And I think he's got a chance to maybe show something this fall. We'll see what happens. I mean, again, getting in front of Trice and ZTF is going to be a monumental task for any of those guys, but they've got some potential. So we'll see what happens.
Chris, in the secondary, they do lose two of their top four. They added in Jabbar Muhammad from Oklahoma State. They added Barkins from Oregon just actually yesterday, if you guys are wondering, recording this on the afternoon of the 23rd, or kind of late morning where Chris is on the West Coast. What's your assessment here of the secondary? The losses look substantial, but maybe they're not. That's why we have summer school to ask you.
Well, again, losing Julius Ervin to injury, a guy who's going to retire, that was tough. I mean, he is a guy that was a veteran presence. They moved him around a corner safety. He was very versatile, had the kind of body you could do that with. And then losing guys like Zachary Spears, Cameron Williams, they lost a few bodies, and they really needed to fortify again. So they went back out to the portal. They got Jabbar Muhammad from Oklahoma State, a kid who was a stalwart in the Big 12, played a ton of years there. Just veteran experience, veteran. Not the biggest kid in the world. He's probably 5'9", but they love him out on the edge. They love the way he competes. And I think he's got a chance to be a starter for Washington week 1. And then on the other side, they've got a bunch of young guys. They did bring in a JUCO guy in Thaddeus Dixon, who I think is got the body type that Julius Brown, the Washington DB coach, loves to see. 6 foot, 6'1", probably about 180, 190. Was a ball hawk, had a few picks in spring football. And then they had a bunch of guys that came back that really were tested in 2022. Young guys like Devon Banks, who's still a little banged up. Elijah Jackson really earned his stripes last year, corner. Michelle Powell, who's the real veteran of that group, but he's probably going to be playing more of the Husky, which is their nickel in the defense that's run by William Inge and Chuck Morrell, the Washington's co-defensive coordinators. So he's been moved kind of more in the slot as a slot corner. But I think Elijah Jackson was the guy that really emerged in spring ball, really showed that he was ready to take that next step. He's kind of the guy that I think the Washington coaches are hoping can make that impact. But again, Devon Banks, a real ball hawk. Bringing in Darren Barkins. We'll see what happens with him. Another kid, not the biggest kid in the world, 5'9", 170. But I'll tell you what, he was also recruited really heavily out of high school by Jimmy Lake. And if anybody knows anything about Washington football the last few years, Jimmy Lake may have not had the greatest tenure as a head coach at Washington, but as a coordinator and as a defensive backs coach and an evaluator of high school defensive back talent, there's very few that could compete with Jimmy Lake on that level. And he had offered Darren Barkins out of high school. So clearly they saw something out of him. My initial thought, not really having seen Barkins play much at Oregon, but just looking at his specs and what he's done, also being a special teams guy, I'm kind of wondering if they're looking at him as a guy that can compete at the slot corner, the Husky, with Michelle Powell, for instance. Because there was a guy that is now playing for the New England Patriots, guy by the name of Miles Bryant out of Washington, that's same size, 5'9", 5'10", 180, whatever. And he was so good at the line of scrimmage for a smaller kid. Just snuffed out the run, great instincts, just knew where to be. And I'm wondering if they see Darren Barkins as that kind of player as well. So right now, if I had to really look at the secondary, look at Jabbar Muhammad, I think he's got the one spot on lockdown on the corner. Other spot could be Thaddeus Dixon, could be Elijah Jackson. I give the nod to Jackson right now, but there's a few bodies in there right now. The slot corner, Michelle Powell. I think Barkins, again, could play. But they've got veteran leadership at the safety positions too. But they've got Asa Turner at one of those safeties. They took Dominique Hampton from the slot corner and moved him back to safety where he was naturally that's where he got recruited at Washington, and he's a thumper. This is a kid legitimately 6'1", 6'2", 220, and he can pound people. So they like that enforcer type with him, a guy that can come down the box, really create some havoc. And so I think that's right now, that's probably how the secondary shakes out after spring ball.
Chris, I got to ask you about special teams here. They had an awesome kicking game last year, and although they did not punt much, they had one of the least efficient punt units in the country. In fact, this is the largest gap. I just found this out today. The largest gap between field goal efficiency and punt efficiency in the nation last year was Washington. Now they lose their field goal kicker. Did Peyton Henry get a COVID year, or is he gone?
No, he's gone. Peyton Henry's gone, and I think I want to say he had gotten some looks in the CFL, but I don't know if he's stuck already. But again, they start so early compared to the NFL. But yeah, Peyton Henry's one of I think 4 or 5 players in Pac-12 history with 400 points or more total in his career. What Peyton Henry did at Washington was absolutely unique and phenomenal. To replace him is going to be a huge task. And they didn't go out. Washington did not go out and get a scholarship kicker. They have 2 kickers right now that kicked in the spring, and they're both walk-ons. One's Grady Gross, who's a right-footed kicker. He was their kickoff guy last year as a true freshman. And then they've got Addison Schrock, who's a left-footed kicker, who was basically Henry's heir apparent, or the guy that would have backed him up last year. So, you've got the left-footed guy in Schrock, you got the right-footed guy in Gross. They both, I would say, had really strong springs, but didn't really distance themselves because I just don't see a lot of special teams work in that area in spring. It's so much more about getting the return game going, the cover game going, that they didn't really give a lot of opportunities for the kickers to go out and go through a full-on competition. So those guys are going to be duking it out in the fall for sure. We'll see who has it. I think Gross has the stronger leg, but I just get the sense that they like Schrock because I think he's maybe a little bit more accurate. I don't get the sense that it's a 2 kicker situation where if they go a certain, if it's 45 and beyond, they might use one guy, and if it's inside, they might use another. I don't get that sense either. I think they want to stick with one guy. But you mentioned the discrepancy in punting and place kicking. And basically, it was a very unique situation last year because they did bring in a scholarship punter in a grad year from Idaho State, guy by the name of Kevin Ryan, and he had 1 punt the entire year. And I think that was like in total mop-up time. Jack McAllister, a walk-on from the area here in Seattle, ended up being their main kicker. And Washington's punter before Jack McAllister was a kid by the name of Race Porter, who was like a 2 or 3 year starter out of O'Day High School right here in downtown Seattle. So they like bringing in the walk-on guys, developing them into the kind of guys that they want. McAllister is a kid that can traditional punt. He can rugby punt. He can roll out. He's a decent athlete. He can kind of do everything they need him to do. And so this year is the year where he needs to show himself as the man, because he could legitimately be a 2 or 3 year guy. I'm a little stunned, frankly, right now, but that he's not on scholarship already. They do have a scholarship based on our numbers that they could give to him maybe before the season starts. So we'll see what happens with that. But there's no doubt that the punting situation needs to improve, but they feel very confident in McAllister that he can give them exactly what they need.
It's kind of one of the situations where, because Washington punts so infrequently, it doesn't really show up. And you're looking on a per punt basis, I'm like, damn, 129th is like, generally the only schools you see down there are max schools because they don't have enough athletes in their reserves to actually cover people, well, or maybe like a New Mexico or something like that. So that's encouraging that McAllister is improving. Chris, I'll get you out of here on this one. I really appreciate the time today. And I think I know the answer, but other than quarterback, when you're at practice and you're watching, where is the spot, the position group where you're like, okay, the drop off from starter to reserve here is just huge. They cannot afford to lose these guys because the backups just they'll never be able to play. But if they got to play them this year, they got trouble brewing.
Well, it's tough because, I don't want to necessarily say running back, but because there were enough running backs that weren't necessarily going full time in spring, it just feels like there's still a lot of question marks there. because
Sure.
Cameron Davis had the best spring that he's had since he's been at Washington. And he comes back as the leading rusher after Wayne Talapapa graduated. So, that, he is considered the number one guy right now, and there's really no question about it. And that's even getting Daniel Ngata from Arizona State. They got Dylan Johnson from Mississippi State, who they're completely high on, and for good reason. I think he's the total package. He's exactly what Ryan Grubb wants in that offense, a guy that can run the ball between the tackles, but can also is equally adept at catching the passes out too, because he caught a ton when he was under Mike Leach. And so, they've got a ton of those guys, but they just didn't really show a ton in spring. They didn't run a ton. I mean, they even have a true freshman in Tybo Rogers that I think Husky fans should be absolutely ecstatic about. I think this is the kid who's the future at the position. But at the same time, it's just hard to know exactly where they're going to go after Cameron Davis, because there's really a truckload of guys behind him, but there wasn't one guy who really established himself as the go-to guy after Davis. So I'm really interested to see what happens there. I would honestly tell you that it's really the defensive backfield. It's tough to know how the depth is going to sort out once you get past the initial guys. And again, I think that's why they went after Darren Barkins, for instance. I think they really felt they needed to get another cornerback to fill that, to fill a hole. And he's a kid that I think, just based on his resume, could fill multiple spots. He could be a corner guy, but he could be a slot corner guy. So he could fill in a couple different roles there. So right now, I do think it's the secondary. I don't necessarily think they have the most question marks, but I do question whether or not the depth is there where the next men up can come in and there's a seamless transition from the first team to the second team.
Chris, we'll all be watching to see if Washington can capture that Pac-12 title this year. I know we're all going to visit Dawgman.com, and I really appreciate the time here on Summer School.
Hey, absolutely. So season can't come here quick enough, but I'm ready to go.